There's a moment, early in Bocil Sultan Raya, where the camera just lingers on this tiny, scuffed-up pair of school shoes resting on a hospital floor, toes still smeared with dried mud, and in the background you hear the beeping of machines and the muffled echo of adults panicking, and in that stillness you realize, this is not just another rags-to-riches fantasy. This is a story about how a kid who should be worrying about homework and recess suddenly wakes up with more money than entire families will ever see in their lifetime, because of a freak accident and a cruel twist of digital fate, and that single shot sets the tone for an entire movie that feels like a strange combination of fairytale, tech thriller, and emotional family drama all rolled into one, wrapped in the flashy packaging of a 2025 Indonesian crowd pleaser that absolutely knows what kind of conversation it wants to start. Before we dive deeper into how this film pulls that off, I have to say this line. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments, because I'm genuinely curious which part of the world you're from and how a story like this lands with you, in your own context, your own economy, your own fears about money, power, and childhood. And now, let's get into Bocil Sultan Raya, this shiny, sometimes chaotic, sometimes heartbreakingly grounded movie that somehow manages to make you laugh at a kid flexing with a limited edition gaming rig 1 minute and then hit you with a gut punch about corporate greed the next, all while asking, what if the richest person in the room is also the smallest, and maybe the most dangerous, because he's still learning what it means to be human. So, Bocil Sultan Raya, released in 2025, arrives in a landscape where we're all just a bit too familiar with absurd overnight success stories, crypto millionaires, viral influencers, teenage entrepreneurs, kids getting paid more from streaming one game than their parents' salary for a whole year, and the film taps into that zeitgeist like it's been sitting there waiting for this exact cultural moment, this exact generation of parents who both want their children to have better lives and are also secretly terrified of what happens if their kid becomes one of those sultans online, flaunting money they don't really understand, while adults in the background scramble to control that wealth, manipulate it, or in some cases, steal it. And the brilliant thing is that the movie never just treats that wealth as pure wish fulfillment, it presents it first as a miracle, then as a game, then as a temptation, and finally as a weapon. We start with our protagonist, called simply Bocil, throughout most of the film, in that very Indonesian way of affectionately reducing a child's identity to a nickname that literally means little kid, which already tells you the film wants to play with the idea of how adults underestimate children, because nobody in this movie truly calls him by a strong, powerful name until very late in the story. Instead, they project onto this Bocil parents, neighbors, YouTubers, business people. Everybody sees a different thing when they look at him, a future investor, a sponsorship opportunity, a marketing gimmick, or just a walking ATM. The opening act is deceptively simple and deeply familiar, a modest household, a struggling family, a regular school day that feels almost boring, with Bocil waking up late, his mom nagging him about finishing his homework and not playing games all night, his dad or older brother complaining about money, about debts, about bills, and the production really sells this monotony with handheld camera work and natural lighting, just calmly dropping us into this small life, this humid morning, the sounds of motorbikes outside, the chatter of neighbors, until the script throws that life into chaos with a single accident. On the way home, there's a car, a sudden screech, a crash, and everything goes slow. But here's where the film is clever. The accident is less about blood and trauma and more about an almost surreal shift in reality, because instead of focusing on broken glass and screaming, we cut inside the car, to a high-tech dashboard, glitching, flickering, numbers going insane, mysterious app running in the background, some kind of smart wealth system or experimental AI investment platform that doesn't just transfer funds, it transfers ownership, rights, and control in a single messy burst of code as the car's encrypted system is thrown into disarray by the crash, and somehow, because Bocil's cheap little phone is in his pocket with some freemium game running, some Wi-Fi or Bluetooth handshake happens at the wrong time, and ownership of something huge and mysterious gets linked to his identity. It sounds wild, almost ridiculous, but the movie leans into that techno-mystical logic. We don't get a lecture on encryption or blockchain, we just see digital paperwork flickering on the screen, a loading bar, his silly in-game nickname popping up next to some legal-sounding entity we don't yet understand, and then cut to black. When Bocil wakes up in the hospital, he's groggy, his mom is crying, nurses are moving in and out, and he feels like any normal kid after a scare, more concerned about whether his phone survived than whether he almost died, and that detail, that kid-like priority, is so true, so strangely funny, and also key to understanding the character, is a child first, Sultan later. The first real hint that something impossible has happened doesn't come with a dramatic messenger in a suit, or a reading of a will, it comes with a notification sound. A ping, a buzz, a little sparkle on his cheap screen, showing numbers that don't make sense, transfers, balances, assets in apps he's never downloaded. And the movie plays this like a horror comedy. He's confused, his mom thinks it's some scam, some spam, his dad shrugs it off, but then the hospital bill, which has been stressing the adults out, gets a notification too, paid. The nurses are confused, the accountant is confused, but the bank confirms, funds came from an account tied to one name, Bocil's. That's the first little jolt that something is different now, and from there, the film escalates, step by step, as the family slowly realizes that not only has their child's financial status changed, but their entire life trajectory has been rewired. This is where the movie begins to slide from grounded family drama into wish fulfillment montage, with Bocil noticing more and more things being automatically paid, debts disappearing, credits being approved, people calling his parents with new opportunities. The camera shifts from grainy realism to smoother tracking shots, brighter colors, as if success itself is adding contrast and clarity to their world. But the script never allows us to forget that none of this is normal. We get these quick, quiet moments of Bocil lying awake at night, scrolling through screens full of numbers he doesn't understand, trying to buy one little thing in his favorite mobile game, only to accidentally trigger a massive purchase in a real financial system, investing in something that turns a profit overnight, like the world is now a casino rigged in his favor, and adults around him are starting to suspect that this kid is not just lucky, he's connected to something bigger. See, what nobody knows yet, including Bocil himself, is that he's become the legal, digital, and perhaps even symbolic owner of a sprawling, shadowy conglomerate, a corporate empire wrapped in shell companies and anonymous boards, something the news calls a mysterious conglomerate, because no one can quite pin down who controls it, who benefits from it, and why it moves money the way that it does. This conglomerate has fingers in everything: construction, tech, entertainment, even the very streaming platforms where kids like Bocil watch gaming videos and dream of being sponsored. This is where the movie's core hook fully kicks in. Bocil isn't just rich, he's the hidden puppet master of a system designed to hide its master. And yet, he's a kid with a lollipop in his mouth and a math test in the morning. That contrast fuels the entire movie, and the story takes its time exploring both halves of his reality. It's not just overnight rich, instant mansion, end of story. The director lets us see how wealth trickles in, first a new smartphone, then a new motorbike for dad, then tuition paid off, then whispers in the neighborhood, then local reporters wanting to interview this lucky family, until one day a sleek black car arrives, tinted windows, stepping out of it a man in a sharp suit we'll come to know as Ardi, the representative from the company. He speaks to Bocil's parents in a tone that's all politeness and hidden threats, subtle manipulation, explaining that due to a technical glitch, some shares, some rights, some tiny parts of a large system might have been accidentally assigned to their son, but not to worry, the company is here to help manage everything, to guide, to protect, to streamline. The parents are dazzled, overwhelmed, and we see Bocil watching this exchange with the wide-eyed curiosity of someone who knows this conversation is about him but doesn't speak the language being used, corporate jargon and legalese, the sound of adults pretending everything is under control. Yet, in a surprising move, the movie doesn't let Ardi become the mustache-twirling villain you might expect. Instead, he's deeply human, a man who started from nothing, built his career inside this very conglomerate, and now finds himself staring at the new owner, a child, with a mix of resentment, fascination, and oddly enough, empathy. There's a key scene where he's sitting next to Bocil in the back of that sleek car, while the boy clutches a gaming console, and Ardi, almost unconsciously, softens his tone, asking, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And Bocil, deadpan, answers, "Rich." Ardi laughs, but it's not a villain's laugh, it's tired, almost bitter, because he's dedicated his life to chasing exactly that, and now he's in the shadow of someone who gained it by accident. This dynamic becomes one of the film's most interesting threads, Ardi as reluctant mentor and possible enemy, Bocil as naive but increasingly strategic student of power. As time goes on, Bocil's life transforms in ways both predictable and shockingly complicated. Yes, he gets the dream stuff, the enormous gaming PC with LED lights, the special edition consoles, the designer sneakers, the private tutors, the access to any toy, game, or gadget his heart desires. We get those montages, full of music and color, him throwing money in mobile games, sponsoring his favorite streamers, even anonymously dropping insane donations into random content creators' streams, watching their shocked reactions with a mischievous grin. One particularly clever sequence shows him jumping from stream to stream, turning small-time creators into overnight sensations with a single super chat, and in doing so, the film subtly mirrors his own story. He is now the unseen force, the algorithmic god, deciding who gets a chance and who doesn't. But the more he plays with this power, the more he starts to notice patterns. He learns how clicks, trends, and investments all tie together. He discovers that the conglomerate he technically owns already has its hands in these streaming platforms, ad networks, sponsor agencies. By the time we realize what he's doing, Bocil is watching the economy around him like it's one giant game interface, each bar and graph just another HP or XP meter that he can manipulate. Yet the movie is careful, we never get the sense that he becomes some cold-hearted mastermind overnight. We see him trying to reconcile two worlds, the one where his classmates call him Bocil Sultan, half-jokingly when he treats them to snacks, and the one where Artie takes him to boardrooms full of men decades older than him, all pretending he's just a cute mascot while secretly feeling threatened by the legal weight his signature now carries. The tragedy, and beauty, of this character is that he doesn't fully understand yet that while the adults think he's a figurehead, he actually holds more control than any of them, because the system, through a glitch, truly recognizes him as the owner. And this is where the script slowly begins to shift from comedic exploration into something darker, more introspective. One thing Bocil Sultan Kaya Raya does really well is show how overwhelming and lonely power can be, especially for a kid. There are quiet scenes where he sits in a massive room, giant TV on, expensive food in front of him, and yet he's scrolling through old photos on his cheap old phone, remembering cramped dinners with his family before all this, when his biggest worry was whether he'd get to watch his favorite gaming channel before bed. He starts feeling the gap between himself and his peers widening. They start acting weird around him, some worship him, some envy him, some distance themselves out of intimidation or confusion. There's a heartbreaking classroom moment where the teacher makes a sly comment about some students having it easier, clearly referencing his wealth, and he wants to sink into his seat, to rewind time, just for one day, to be invisible again. But you can't go back, and the film doesn't let him, instead pushing him further into the maze of adult decisions. What makes the story sharper than just a moral about money isn't everything, is the way it links Bocil's journey to the shadowy conglomerate in the background. Gradually, through headlines, news reports with dramatic voiceovers, and hushed conversations between Artie and his superiors, we learn that this conglomerate isn't just big, it's notorious. It's involved in land disputes, construction scandals, data privacy controversies, all the modern sins of post-digital capitalism. At first, Bocil only gets glimpses, protesters outside a building with his conglomerate's name on it, people shouting slogans about corruption, eviction, the rich crushing the poor. When he asks Artie about it, Artie deflects, saying, "These things are complicated." And here's where Bocil's character begins a subtle transformation. You would expect a kid in his position to either completely ignore these issues or be used as a PR tool to humanize the company, but the film gives him more agency. His love of games, his instinct to explore systems and seek patterns, begins to merge with a child's sense of fairness. He starts to question why a company that can erase his family's debt with a click can't do the same for others. He asks Artie why some families are being kicked out of their homes for a new mall project his company is building. He wonders why a company that makes billions off ads aimed at kids doesn't do more to protect them. There's a beautifully written scene where Bocil sits across from Artie in a quiet corporate lounge, the city lights glowing outside, and he asks, "If I'm the owner, can I stop things?" And Artie, visibly torn, answers, "On paper, yes." In reality, it's never that simple. This line becomes one of the film's thematic anchors, the gap between legal ownership and real control, between having your name on something and being strong enough to face everything that comes with it. As the story moves into its second half, this becomes a story not just about a kid getting rich, but about a kid slowly, painfully realizing that he is both a beneficiary and a perpetrator of a system that hurts people, often people like his own neighbors. The emotional stakes intensify when that system comes home. The movie needed a grounded turning point, and it finds it in a subplot involving a local neighborhood issue, a piece of land near Bocil's old street, used by kids to play football and by small vendors to sell food, suddenly marked for development by the very conglomerate he technically owns. We see familiar faces, the snack seller who always slipped him an extra skewer for free, the uncle who patched up his bike, now facing eviction notices branded with a logo that he's just seen in his company's annual report. When they all huddle in a community meeting, complaining about those heartless corporate people, Bocil sits there in silence, heart pounding, realization dawning. The script doesn't go for a melodramatic outburst right away, it lets that guilt simmer. He goes home, stares at screens full of contracts and project plans, sees the profit forecasts, the shareholder smiles, and then he looks at a photo of that field, taken when he was younger, standing with a cheap plastic trophy from some local kids' tournament, grinning. The film's direction in these scenes is incredibly effective, the color grading grows colder, the sound design more distant, as if wealth is literally draining warmth from his world. And yet, despite this darkness creeping in, the movie never completely loses its accessibility. It still has humor, especially in how Bocil navigates being a Bocil Sultan in the age of social media. There are segments where he's invited to talk shows, kids programs, podcasts, even cameoing in a music video, all of them trying to leverage his viral fame. We get scenes of clumsy influencers trying too hard to collab with him, calling him bro and little boss, while he awkwardly smiles, more comfortable behind a keyboard than in front of a camera. These moments are intentionally cringy, satirizing the way our culture commodifies anything unusual, even a child's freak accident fortune. But they also serve as a mirror. The audience laughs, but also recognizes how quickly we elevate and consume people online without thinking about the pressure we're piling on them. In that sense, Bocil becomes not only a character but an allegory for any child thrust into the spotlight, whether it's through fame, money, or something else entirely. Still, the emotional heart of the movie remains with his relationships, especially with his family. His mother, in particular, is not just a generic, worried mom archetype. She's written and acted with nuance, initially thrilled that her child will never have to suffer like she did, then increasingly conflicted as she watches him get pulled into adult spaces. She's the one who still tries to enforce bedtime while a board meeting buzzes on loudspeaker. She's the one who turns off his screen when he's about to sign something, asking, "Do you even understand this?" There's a scene where she confronts Artie, saying, "You said you'd help manage things so he could live like a normal kid, but nothing about his life is normal now," and Artie, again, doesn't give a villain monologue, he just looks tired, trapped between his job and his conscience. Bocil's father, or in some versions it could be his older brother depending on the scripting choice, provides a different perspective. He's more easily seduced by the lifestyle, by the cars, the status, the chance to finally be respected, and his arc becomes a cautionary tale about what happens when adults start depending on their child's power instead of protecting that child from it. He pushes for bigger moves, bigger investments, maybe even entertains the fantasy of becoming some kind of co-boss. There are subtle but powerful moments where Bocil sees his dad change, becoming more obsessed with meetings, less present at home, and that absence, ironically, hurts more now than when they were poor, because back then, the struggle at least kept them together emotionally. Now money has entered the chat, and it is loud. As we move deeper into the film, the line between Bocil's childlike experimentation and true strategic action starts to blur. One of the most interesting narrative decisions is to connect his gaming skills to his emerging understanding of corporate warfare. There's a clever visual metaphor where the board of directors meeting is intercut with footage of him playing a complex strategy game. He moves pieces on a digital map, allocates resources, anticipates enemy moves, while in the boardroom, Artie and others are discussing market competition, hostile takeovers, legal risks. At first, Bocil is outside both worlds. The game is his escape from the real meeting happening beyond closed doors. But as the story goes on, we see him bringing ideas from the game into the real boardroom, suggesting unconventional tactics, pointing out patterns that the adults missed because they are too locked into old mentalities. They laugh at him at first, but then his instincts prove right, again and again, because he's grown up in an information-saturated, fast-paced environment where adaptability is instinctive. He understands virality, meme culture, online backlash in ways they don't. When a scandal threatens the conglomerate's image, it's Bocil who suggests leveraging smaller creators, grassroots campaigns, real community support instead of just cold press releases. It's almost chilling to watch him evolve from a clueless kid to a budding strategist, because we're rooting for him, but we're also watching innocence being weaponized. This duality runs through every choice he makes. When he tries to use the conglomerate's resources to help the people in his neighborhood, for instance, it's touching, noble even, but it also puts him directly at odds with other shareholders who only care about profit. The film gradually reveals that while the system accidentally put him at the top, there are still many people with enough leverage to challenge him, circumvent him, even try to remove him if he becomes a threat to their interests. This conflict reaches a boiling point when he uses his legal authority, after quietly studying contracts and digital keys late at night, in sequences scored like a heist movie but with spreadsheets instead of safes, to halt the very construction project threatening his local field. In a climactic press conference, he appears, not as the cute mascot, but as the actual signatory, surprising everyone. The lawyers scramble, the board panics, and the media catches wind. The once mysterious owner of the conglomerate is actually a child, and that child is taking a moral stand. This is where the film's pacing, which up to this point has been a bit wild, zigzagging between comedy, family scenes, corporate drama, and slick montages, suddenly locks into focus. Everything slows for a moment as we watch Bocil deliver a short, trembling speech. He doesn't speak like a seasoned CEO, he speaks like a kid who has seen too much. He talks about that field, about playing football barefoot, about uncles selling food by the side of the road. He asks, simply, if our company is so big, so strong, why are we fighting people who are small and weak? Isn't it easy for us to move somewhere else? The room is silent. Cameras flash. The adults in suits squirm because this is the one thing they fear, a moral argument that exposes the pettiness of their greed. Even Ardi is shaken, pride and fear wrestling in his eyes. From a filmmaking perspective, this is one of the most emotionally charged scenes, and the actor playing Bocil sells it with a mix of vulnerability and stubbornness that reminds us he's still a child. No melodramatic screaming, just a quiet insistence that something is wrong. But the movie is too honest to suggest that one speech fixes everything. The immediate aftermath is messy and realistic. Yes, the project is temporarily halted, the field is saved for now, and Bocil becomes a hero online, with hashtags and fan edits and inspirational quotes. Yet behind closed doors, the power struggle intensifies. Some board members start plotting how to limit his control, maybe argue legal incompetence due to his age, push for guardianship structures that would sideline him. Others, more idealistic or opportunistic, sense that aligning with him could be a way to reshape the company's image and direction. In the middle of all this is Ardi, who finds himself increasingly drawn to Bocil's simple sense of justice, even as he's pressured by his superiors to get the boy in line. That internal conflict makes him one of the most compelling characters in the film. He's not just a foil, he's almost a future version of Bocil, what the kid could become if he gives into cynicism. There's a quiet scene late at night where Ardi and Bocil share instant noodles in a pantry, away from the polished corporate cafeteria, and Ardi tells a story about his own childhood, playing in a cramped alley, dreaming of the city lights. He confesses that he once promised himself he would never again be the powerless kid getting pushed around by landlords and bosses, and yet, here he is, part of the machine doing the pushing. Bocil listens, eyes wide, and you can tell he's absorbing more than just the story. He's seeing the path ahead, the tempting, dangerous path of rationalizing away your own conscience in the name of survival and success. This intergenerational reflection is one of the film's strongest emotional beats, grounding the flashy premise in a universal tension. As you grow up and gain more power, do you become the bully you used to fear, or do you find a way to hold on to your younger self's belief in fairness? On a cinematic level, Bocil Sultan Kaya Raya isn't always subtle, but it is consistently engaging. The camera loves to contrast small and big, small bodies in big rooms, tiny hands signing giant contracts, that cheap old phone buzzing on a marble table. The color palette shifts as Bocil's internal world shifts, warm, noisy hues in the beginning, cooler, more sterile tones in corporate settings, and then a kind of hybrid visual style in later scenes where he's trying to bring those two worlds together. The music alternates between upbeat tracks that capture the dizzy thrill of his new life and slower, melancholic themes that remind us of what's being lost. It's not a perfect movie. Some sequences run a bit long, some side characters feel more like symbols than fully fleshed out people, and there are moments where the film's reach, commenting on capitalism, digital culture, childhood trauma, family dynamics, corporate ethics, slightly exceeds its grasp. But even when it stumbles, it does so in interesting ways, always trying to say something real about this hyper-connected, hyper-capitalist era where kids are not just consumers but sometimes, bizarrely, major economic actors. Performance-wise, the young actor playing Bocil carries the entire film. If he were even slightly less convincing, the whole premise would collapse into farce. But he nails the wide-eyed awe, the childish greed, the sudden flashes of comprehension, the quiet, brooding looks when he realizes his choices have consequences. There's a particular look he gives the camera in a late scene, after making a ruthless but necessary business decision to save jobs at the cost of cutting a program he personally loved. That's haunting. You can see the adult he's becoming and the child he used to be coexisting for a second, then one recedes. The supporting cast ranges from solid to outstanding, with the actors playing his mother and Ardi standing out for their layered, emotionally honest work. What truly elevates Bocil Sultan Kaya Raya beyond just being a fun, high-concept youth drama is how it loops back to its own twisted origin story, that accident that transferred ownership to him. Midway through the story, it's easy to forget that this began with chaos, a car crash, a glitch, but the screenplay smartly returns to that moment in the third act, revealing more about the previous owner of the conglomerate and why the system was designed the way it was. Through documents revealed to Bocil and Ardi, we learn that the conglomerate's founder, an elusive tech and real estate magnate who died under mysterious circumstances, actually engineered a failsafe in his digital estate. If the system ever detected a crash, literal or metaphorical, at the heart of the company, it would transfer ownership to a randomly selected individual in the vicinity, chosen from ordinary people, databases, as a way to break elite control. It's a twisted kind of wealth redistribution, at once genius and reckless, and the fact that it latched onto Bocil at the moment of his accident is both poetic and deeply unsettling. This revelation reframes the entire story. Bocil isn't just a victim of a glitch, he's the product of a deliberate, radical experiment by a dead billionaire who decided that the only way to fix the system was to inject chaos into it. The ethical implications are staggering. Is it fair to thrust that burden onto a child? Did the founder foresee this exact scenario? Or did he underestimate how brutal it would be on the chosen one? The film doesn't offer clean answers. Instead, it uses this twist to push Bocil further into a role he initially didn't choose but now feels compelled to own. He starts to see himself not just as a lucky kid, but as someone with a responsibility, not to the shareholders, not to the media, but to this strange, flawed idea of a system that can be forced, through randomness, to confront the voices it usually ignores. This is where the theme of the Bocil as dalang, the child as puppet master, comes into sharp focus. In Indonesian culture, the concept of the dalang, the puppeteer behind the scenes, resonates deeply, especially through wayang performances where unseen hands animate entire worlds of shadow and light. Bocil becomes a modern dalang, not in a mythical forest but in a jungle of servers, stock prices, and algorithmic feeds. At first, he's the puppet, yanked around by circumstances, adults, and digital forces beyond his comprehension. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, he starts to grab those strings back, rearranging the moveset, learning how to pull one thread here to make a change over there. He understands, for example, that a single viral story can tank a project more effectively than 1,000 protests. He knows that taking a stand about that field in his neighborhood will not only save it in reality but also send a message across millions of screens. He realizes that he can use the visibility of being Bocil Sultan Kaya Raya to expose hypocrisy, to redirect resources, even to play different factions within his own conglomerate against each other. And here's where the film flirts with something almost scary, the idea that a child, shaped by games and internet culture, could become a new kind of corporate tactician, one not bound by traditional ethics or strategies. The script keeps that tension alive. We want him to succeed, to use his power for good, but we also can't help but feel a twinge of fear when we see how easily he learns to manipulate. In a late sequence, for instance, he orchestrates a seemingly spontaneous wave of public support for a social housing initiative by anonymously seeding edited clips, influencer talking points, and a catchy hashtag, effectively steamrolling opposition from stodgier board members without ever raising his voice in the boardroom. It's brilliant, it's effective, and it's also a bit chilling, demonstrating the raw power of someone who intuitively understands how narrative works in the age of social media. Yet, the film never abandons his vulnerability. After this stunning victory, we see him alone again, exhausted, almost spooked by his own influence, scrolling through the flood of praise and hate comments alike, absorbing both like a sponge. The movie is honest about the psychological toll of constant online exposure, especially on a young mind. Some of the most heartbreaking moments aren't about money at all, they're about the way he starts to measure himself through likes, shares, headlines, as if his entire worth is now tied to being that viral Bocil Sultan, instead of just being a kid. That tension between persona and person echoes what countless child stars, influencers, and prodigies go through in the real world, and the film deserves credit for not glossing over it. The pacing across the runtime reflects this emotional rollercoaster. The first half is a rush, discovery, expansion, flexing, while the second half slows down, deepens, complicates. Some viewers might feel the weight of that shift, but it's necessary, because this is not just a story about how cool it is to be wealthy as a child, it's a story about what that does to your heart, your family, your sense of right and wrong. By the time we approach the ending, Bocil has gone from dazed accident victim to accidental owner to intentional actor. He has tested the edges of his power, learned some of its rules, broken others. He has helped people and hurt people. For older viewers, especially those juggling work, family, and anxieties about the future, it could be a strangely cathartic exploration of a thought experiment. What if all that power we chase so desperately ended up in the hands of someone who isn't even old enough to drive? Would they handle it better, worse, or just differently? The film refuses to give a one-size-fits-all answer, and that's precisely its power. From a critical standpoint, it's not flawless. Some plot mechanics are convenient, some dialogue leans a bit too expository, and at times the tonal shifts between comedic, Bocil Sultan, antics and heavy corporate melodrama can feel jarring, but even these imperfections speak to the ambition of the project. It's trying to weave together threads that most mainstream movies keep separate: children's perspective, financial systems, social justice, digital identity. If anything, its overstuffed nature mirrors the overload of information and responsibility that defines Bocil's own life. And that central performance, the way the young actor embodies this weird, dizzy space between innocence and influence, keeps it all anchored in something achingly human. When the lights come up or the stream ends, you might find yourself thinking about your own definitions of success, about what you would do if a glitch handed you the keys to an empire, and about how easy or hard it is to stay kind, playful, and fair when the world gives you the power to do otherwise. In the end, Bocil Sultan Kaya Raya is less about the fantasy of being rich as a kid and more about the burden of being conscious in a world that treats everything, even childhood, as a resource to be mined. It asks us, if the smallest, most underestimated person in the room can begin to change how a monstrous conglomerate behaves, what excuse do the rest of us have for not trying, in whatever small way we can, to push the systems around us towards something a little more humane? It's a big, messy, emotional, sometimes hilarious, sometimes heartbreaking movie, and it lingers in your mind hours after you've finished it, like the fading echo of that hospital monitor at the beginning, reminding you that all of this started with a fragile, vulnerable life, and that underneath the billions, the charts, the headlines, that's what really matters. And as we wrap up this review, I'm curious what you think about a story like this, whether you see it as a wild fantasy, a warning, or maybe a reflection of where our world is headed. What if the richest person in the room can't even reach the table? What if the most powerful signature in a high-rise boardroom belongs to a boy whose school uniform still smells faintly like chalk and fried banana? What if the noise of Jakarta's traffic was just a drumroll for the kind of story you don't believe until it taps you twice on the shoulder and whispers, "It's me," because that's exactly what Bocil Sultan Kaya Raya does in its first quiet, mischievous minutes, setting up an urban fairy tale that wears the clothes of a techno-thriller and the heart of a coming-of-age film. And I'll tell you right now, I was hooked from the first shot of a paper kite trembling in heat-hazed air to the last glance, that silent, ocean-deep stare that makes you ask whether power ever truly leaves the hands of those who learn to hold it gently. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments, because this is one of those films that thrives on conversation, that grows and mutates as communities debate it late at night in comment threads and roadside stalls, and I want to hear your city, your street, the neighborhood where you watched this and how that changed what you felt. Released in 2025, Bocil Sultan Kaya Raya arrives with a kind of local legend already stitched into its name. Sultan as the shorthand for kids who flex borrowed supercars on social media, Kaya Raya as the phrase that tumbles out of your mouth when you see a number so big it needs commas to breathe, and inside that, the film finds a small boy with an old soul, a child whose innocence is not the absence of calculation but the presence of a different kind, one that comes from noticing what adults forget when they are rushing to be seen, and in the background you can feel the city itself, Jakarta, but not only Jakarta, really any megacity where glass meets concrete and debt meets dreams, pulling in and out like a tide. This movie opened in Indonesian theaters before pouring itself across Southeast Asia, and the way audiences responded, wow, if you were there the first week you know how it felt to sit in a dark room while the air vibrated with disbelief and laughter and tiny, unguarded sobs that people tried to cover by unwrapping snacks a little too loudly, and even if you streamed it later, you probably felt that same low hum of shock as the story unfolded with just enough restraint to keep your mind sprinting ahead. While your heart prayed it would slow down, the premise, held like a coin between two fingers and flashed only when necessary, is this: a small, almost invisible accident tunes a little boy into a system he shouldn't have access to, a system that begins to pour wealth into his life with the indifferent regularity of rain, and overnight, the boy nicknamed Bocil becomes a kind of folk story, a kid who can buy the moonlight if he wants to. But the film is sly and refuses spectacle for its own sake. Because extravagance is not the point here, power is, and the way a child's mind can learn to hide inside an idea until the idea becomes a house that even grown men can't find a door into. I want to stay spoiler light, because a lot of this film's electricity lives in the suggestion, in the way the camera pauses on passwords and contracts and the patterns of streetlight through car windows. But yes, the marketing does not lie. There is a mysterious conglomerate, a shadowy shape on the skyline, with too many subsidiaries to count, and the boy at the center, call him Raka, because names matter and Raka sounds like something you can chant when you're scared, appears to be connected to it in a way that made people in my theater lean forward in their seats until I was sure the entire row would tip. The accident is small in the way fate enjoys being petty, a chain link moment stitched from rain, a stray piece of infrastructure, a flicker of code that loops in the wrong direction, and the film never over-explains it, because gigantic outcomes rarely come with neat causes in real life either, and once it happens, once the system recognizes Raka as a node that money trusts, you watch his life expand and contract like a heartbeat, first in tiny purchases, a new bicycle glistening like a promise, a pair of shoes that finally fit, and then in sharper angles, debt forgiven for the one that lets his mother stand a little straighter, a quiet replacement of the rattling motor that used to carry his father home sweat-salted and defeated, the school fees paid for classmates whose parents had stopped making eye contact at pickup, all of it handled with a discretion that in itself feels like a child's perfect rebellion against the loudness of adult victory, and this is where the performances beam with the warmth of real human plasma, because newcomer Fadli Arya, who plays Raka, operates in the narrow space between blankness and brilliance, between the smile that adults call cute and the silence that makes them uneasy, and he has this way of holding his face like a mask until you catch the flicker behind his eyes, that tiny calculation rolling like a coin between thoughts. It's astonishing, and it makes the whole film rise like steam off hot pavement, because when a child actor can hold a still frame and scare you just a little, not because he's evil but because he's already been taught by the world to protect himself by thinking 3 moves ahead, that is a miracle of casting and directing. Raka's parents, played by Wulan Pramswari and Argo Santoso, are not clichés, not cardboard plot movers. They are people who carry tiredness the way you carry a sleeping child, mostly with love but occasionally with a grimace when the weight shifts, and the way they react to sudden money is both heartbreak and hope, because who among us has not promised ourselves that wealth would not change us, only to find that it changes everything around us so thoroughly that holding still becomes a form of rebellion, and their protectiveness over Raka gives the film its anchor, its reed-bent song against the storm. There is also a journalist, Maya, who smells story the way a fisherman smells rain, and an elegantly dangerous executive named Nadia, who has the kind of face that corporate myths are poured over like syrup, and a classmate with too loud sneakers and not enough shame. A teacher who senses abnormal weather in his classroom and tries the small spells teachers use. Praise, detentions, extra assignments, to contain it, and a friend named Demas whose loyalty is the kind of softness that capitalism loves to weaponize, and each of these characters feels lived in, as if the production met them on the street and asked permission to borrow their afternoons. Cinematographically, the movie walks like a thief in a museum, quiet, precise, lit by a grid of attention that knows exactly where to rest, and director Naila Pramana, working with cinematographer Isan Nugroho, builds a visual grammar out of disproportions, placing the camera so that tables become great planes and windows complicate themselves into mirrors, and there's this motif with glass, car windows, office walls, the cheap screen protector on Raka's phone, that keeps shimmering between protection and prison, and it's so elegantly done that you don't notice it until a late scene when a smear of grease on glass catches a face and refuses to let it go. Color, too, tells the story in a language deeper than words. Early scenes are washed in sickly fluorescence and drained neon, a palette that feels like a city waking up before it's ready, and as money enters, the colors don't become richer so much as more precise, saturated pockets of red and gold that pop like coins in a well. But then, in boardroom scenes and legal offices, the palette thins back out into cool grays and disciplined blues, as if to show that the space is designed for power, distrust, emotion, and therefore drain color out of their own walls. The sound design is a small symphony of push notifications and whispered tones that almost feel like breath, and Adri Putra's score does the thing I love most in contemporary scoring, which is to blend tradition and glitch, so you'll be floating on a thin mist of gamelan when a synthesizer entry slices the air like a signature, and then, in a moment where Raka realizes that solving one problem has folded two more into the shape of his shadow, the score disappears entirely and you hear only the distant caw of a bird and the mic scratch of a lapel as someone shifts their weight, and it is unbearable and beautiful. Now, the handling of the system itself is one of the film's smartest decisions, because it refuses the twin temptations of exposition dump and pure magic, instead giving us glimpses of an algorithmic architecture that feels like a city map without labels, and as Raka explores it, the camera often leaves his face and watches his hands, watches the way he learns to move a finger in a little circle above the glass before tapping, a ritual for luck or simply a way to reset his heartbeat, and when he begins to transfer sums that might accidentally change the price of rice in a suburb he's never visited, you see this boy pausing, counting to 3, learning the ethics of hesitation in a world that rewards speed. Along the way, the film protects its secrets without being coy, which is a rare and delicate thing. And while the trailers tease the notion that Raka might be the mastermind behind the mysterious conglomerate that everyone is chasing, the story gives you a slow-motion revelation that isn't about gotcha but about gravity, about the way a little decision made alone in a bedroom at 2 a.m. can ripple against the hulls of ships docked in ports you've only seen on Instagram, and the scenes in which Raka creates shells within shells, legally invisible, practically inevitable, are shot with the same tenderness as the scenes of him eating dinner with his mother off metal plates while the TV shouts yet another scandal into the steam. One of the joys of this movie is how it understands the performative ecology of modern life without wagging its finger at you. So yes, there are montages of social media reacting to this phantom wealth, the Sultan talk spilling in bright, chaotic threads full of WKWK and heart emojis and moral outrage pasted over envy, and yes, we get those quick cuts of unboxing videos and street corner hot takes and the incessant ping of someone being tagged in a post without permission, but those sequences feel like weather, not villainy, and they are balanced by small moments of silence, such as Raka standing at the window while it rains, or his father sitting on the edge of the bed to loosen his shoelaces and then stopping, and held still, as if deciding to live in that second for as long as it takes for a future he never asked for to catch up to him. Thematically, you can hang thought on this movie the way you hang laundry in the afternoon, every idea damp and fluttering in the same breeze, and for me, the central spirit is the dangerous romance between power and innocence. What happens when someone unscarred by adult cynicism inherits the keys to a machine designed by people who taught themselves how not to flinch, and what happens to the idea of childhood when money renders certain lessons optional, because the film refuses the easy ground of money corrupts, and instead asks whether money simply accelerates the revelation of who we already are, which is why Raka's kindness feels simultaneously authentic and weaponized by his environment, his generosity creating loyalty that becomes, inevitably, a kind of control. there's also a rich theme here about the quiet crimes of infrastructure, the way systems are built with little trapdoors for people with the correct badge, and in this case the badge accidentally goes to a child, and watching him move through adult architecture is both exhilarating and harrowing, because you see how often adults rely on ritual to believe they are in control, and ritual, keycards, lanyards, linked calendars, can be imitated by anyone who understands rhythms better than rules, and children are very, very good at rhythm. The performances around Raka amplify this with deliberately imperfect edges. Wulan Pramswari's mother cries once in the whole film, and not when you expect. She lets one tear slide down and then keeps stirring the pot because the rice doesn't care how you feel, while Argo Santoso's father has this one scene where he asks Raka where the money found them, and it's played with such worn-in tenderness that you feel simultaneously older and younger than both of them, and in the same breath, Maya the journalist, portrayed by Sari India, starts as a trope and refuses to remain one, peeling back the honey-coated press releases to find the original bitterness, but instead of deciding to blow it all apart, she sits with what she's learned like a person who knows that truth is a bird that must land by itself. Nadia the executive, played by Ayu Rahaja with a smile like a blade, elegantly embodies the city's moral negotiation with the child's ascension, because you never quite see her as a villain either. She is a caretaker of a machine, and machines demand caretakers who can sleep with their eyes open, pacing-wise. The movie has a second act that's rich with montage and sound, with those crisp relational beats where cause yanks consequence across the screen like a kite string, and some will say it slows down in the third act, but I felt that deceleration as the responsible application of gravity, the acceptance that momentum should not be confused with meaning, and every minute that threatens to sag is quickly saved by a line of dialogue that trips you backward into attention, like the moment Raka tells Demas, "Silence is profit," a phrase that later exploded into memes. But within the scene plays as a prayer, as a defense against his own restlessness. Spoilers are landmines here, but I can say that the final stretch is not about punishment or reward but about thresholds, about how far a child can walk into a labyrinth before he decides to begin drawing a map for others, and the way the film visualizes that decision: shadows, a toy car rolling through a beam of light, a contract printed and then folded into a paper bird, is gentle and gutting, and the last image, without telling you what it is exactly, has the kind of elemental clarity that great endings reach for. The feeling of air leaving your lungs and entering the sky is something else entirely. Now, on the cultural front, this movie didn't just land, it scattered seeds and then waited for the weather to do the rest, and in the days after its release, you could see the internet rearranging itself around its lines and images, kids posting sketches of Raka's room with annotated theories written in messy school pen, parents arguing about allowances and ethics and whether it's possible to raise a child tenderly in a country where money spits on the sidewalk and keeps walking, educators sharing snippets of the classroom scenes with captions about how they recognized the subtle shift in a child's gaze when adult world problems sit quietly at the back of the lesson, financial influencers making joke videos about the Raka protocol, and then, a week later, sober threads about the actual systemic gaps the film allegorizes, in Indonesia particularly, but honestly across any place in the world where Bocil Sultan has become a meme. This film grabbed that phrase by the collar and shook it until the coins fell out, then asked us to pay attention to what we could build with those coins besides clout, and the conversation has been messy and beautiful, with some arguing that the film glamorizes youthful cunning while others say it forces us to reckon with the way we cheer for ruthless adults but become squeamish when ruthless intelligence shows up in small bodies, because the story doesn't let us off the hook, it asks what we reward and why. To me, that's the point of great pop culture, to take a term that has been worn smooth by jokes and return to some of its sharpness, and Bocil Sultan Kaya Raya manages this without preaching, letting the audience feel both seduced and sobered. And if you've been in a theater with teenagers during the boardroom scenes, you know exactly the kind of electricity I'm talking about, that sound that isn't quite laughter, the inhale that rings when a child moves a chess piece adults didn't even see. One thing I adored, maybe because of the channel we're on and the way games have taught a generation to read systems as landscapes, is how the movie frames the system like a map, not a monster, and how Raka's curiosity feels like the curiosity of a speedrunner who finds a glitch and then must decide whether exploiting it makes the game less or more honest, and the visual language leans into this with UI overlays that hover for a breath and then evaporate, with login screens that are treated like doorways rather than riddles, with the way the camera takes the perspective of a loading bar when Raka waits for confirmation, because tension in the digital age often wears the face of a spinning wheel, and the filmmakers have the courage to live there. To let a white circle turning on a black screen hold the weight of a moral decision. Also, the humor, bless it, is shot through the script like tiny lights in a dark hallway, never droop, and to the sound mixer, whose name I couldn't catch in the credits because the theater lights were already whispering us out, for building a world where ringtones felt like dialogue and silence carried more meaning than speeches, and to the production design that made every room feel exactly lived enough, stacks of papers tilted to an angle that suggested a human hand had just left the frame. Finally, the verdict, though that word feels too courtroom for a film that prefers riddles, is that Bocil Sultan Raya is one of those rare pieces of popular cinema that looks like a mirror but behaves like a window, a story that lets you see yourself in it and then, when you lean closer, shows you the horizon beyond. And I don't know what else we can ask from art except that it hold us, challenge us, and then set us back down a little changed, a little braver, a little more suspicious of the systems that pretend to be neutral while choosing sides in the background. If you're a parent, it might make you hug your child tighter. If you're a child, it might make you look at adults with kinder eyes and sharper questions. If you're a policymaker, it might make you wonder which trapdoors you've forgotten to lock. And if you're just someone who loves movies that whisper loud enough to echo, I think this one will take up residence in your chest and pay rent on time, not with cash but with images, with phrases, with the knowledge that the tallest building in any city is the story that the city tells itself every morning. So watch it, sit with it, argue with it, share it with people who will argue back, and when the final shot resolves into your memory like a photograph developing, maybe, just maybe, let it ask you the question it asked me. What would you do if the system loved you for no reason, and could you love it back without becoming another system in return? And I'll leave you with that because sometimes the best thing a reviewer can do is point you toward the place where the light bends and then step away, grateful and a little stunned, until we meet again in the next story, in the next darkened room where the only thing we have to hold is the hush, the shared breath, the feeling of being seen by a flicker of light and sound. And in that hush, I want to tuck one last thing. If you've ever looked at a child and seen a future that you weren't entirely ready for, this film is for you. It's for all of us learning to greet tomorrow without looking down at our legs to see whether they've grown long enough to reach the floor. Overpowering the mood but puncturing the heaviness just when it threatens to congeal. And my favorite recurring joke is so simple: adults keep trying to speak to Raka in the language of big numbers, expecting awe, but he keeps replying with small requests. Can we eat now? Can I go outside? Can you stop shouting? And the timing is perfect, the performance is hyper-detailed, the way a micro-smile flicks across a mouth before being swallowed by the next moment, and it's this precision that makes the film feel larger than itself, because it respects the intelligence of its audience while also respecting the fragility of the boy it follows. The script, credited to Naila Pramana and Rami Dewantara, is patient and curious, always leaving enough air in the room for actors to breathe, and the dialogue has a kind of unscripted quality without indulging in mess, clean enough to feel designed, frayed enough to feel heard on a bus. If I have quibbles, and I must because honesty is a form of care, there are a couple of side threads: Maya's editor pushing for a scoop, a union meeting within one of the conglomerate's factories, that feel like they were born as fuller arcs and then trimmed to the bone, leaving behind elegant skeletons that in another cut might have danced. And there's a scene of visual metaphor, coins falling in slow motion, that edges toward indulgence before being saved by a cut so sharp it leaves a pleasing scar. But these are small ripples on a surface that mostly carries mirrored clouds. The heart of my praise, though, belongs to the way the film merges its cinematic language with its ethical concerns, because every aesthetic choice is also a moral one here. The shallow focus in early scenes locking Raka into a small world that broadens as he gains agency. The sound stage choices isolating adult voices into a texture rather than content when they talk over him. The costuming moving from hand-me-down softness into crisp cotton that always looks a little too new, like something borrowed from the future. And there's this one visual trope I haven't stopped thinking about. When Raka listens to adults debate him in absentia, the camera leaves the adults and watches the dust in a sunbeam, as if to say that dust is the only honest witness. And that's an image I'm going to keep in my pocket for a long time. Of course, people have asked whether the story is plausible, whether a kid could really become the ghost in the machine behind a conglomerate large enough to rearrange neighborhoods, and the movie answers with a shrug and a mirror, because the point isn't whether this happened but whether we live in a world where it could, where code writes policy in pencil and policy erases consequences with a smile. and in that sense the film is less a prediction than a parable, not a warning so much as a whisper of recognition, and in a media climate that often shouts, "I'm grateful for a story that trusts murmurs." Let's talk about the little scenes, the ones that don't fit into trailers but make the story stick to your ribs. Raka practicing signatures with his left hand even though his right hand, because anonymity sometimes looks like clumsiness, his mother tying a bag of fried snacks with a care usually reserved for wrapping gifts, because feeding people is how she reminds herself the world is not only a ledger, Demas making a paper hat and placing it on Raka's head, and the way Raka flinches as if someone has tried to press a crown into his hair, a teacher's bulletin board covered in a collage of headlines and permission slips, and tucked into a corner a drawing of a skyscraper with eyes, a taxi ride at Blue Hour where the driver's radio slips between stations, catching a protest chant in one and a soccer score in another, threading a city's heartbeat into an accidental lullaby, a scene in which Raka gently removes a line item from a budget that would have destroyed a neighborhood's market, then uses his phone camera to zoom into a photograph of that market until the pixels behave like grain, like memory, like the texture of moral certainty, and then the one that got me, Raka sitting on a curb, his shoes off, his toes pressing into warm asphalt, and in his lap a receipt that looks, for a moment, like a map home. The critical reception has been lively, to say the least, with some praising the laudable audacity of centering a child while refusing to infantilize him, and others wringing hands at what they call narrative irresponsibility for not hammering down a single moral answer. But let me offer this to those who want a clearer line: childhood is not a place, it is a tension between unearned mercy and undeserved fear, and to find a narrative answer to that would be to betray it, and Bocil Sultan Kaya Raya refuses that betrayal without refusing comfort. The way the film handles the Sultan culture is also noteworthy, neither mocking nor endorsing, simply contextualizing, showing how a name can be a toy or a weapon depending on who's holding it, and you can feel the filmmaker's affection for the chaotic digital agora in which reputations are made and dissolved, memes are minted, and some kid in one corner of the city can send a video that will outlive the very place where it was shot. As for the lasting impact, I suspect we'll see this film referenced in classrooms and startup pitches and policy papers and church sermons alike, because it's the kind of story that wears different clothes depending on who needs it, and the fact that it's also a pleasure to watch, a carefully crafted piece of cinema that knows how to tension and release, how to slide into your bloodstream and keep your pulse just a little faster than usual. Well, that's the gift. If you're coming to it for pure entertainment, you will get it: chases, negotiations, close calls, jokes, and those delicious just-in-time solves that movies train us to love. And if you're coming to it for critique, you will get that too. With the film's complex position on capitalism's appetite, its refusal to imagine that money can be pure even when used for good, because purity is the language of people trying to sell you something, and the boy at the center is not trying to sell you anything except perhaps the idea that power can be held lightly and that lightness can be heavy. In terms of craft specifics, I want to tip a hat to the editing by Bhima Kuznandar, which keeps the story elastic without letting it. So if you're still here, still thinking about this tiny kid steering a monster of a company, then you already know there's more to dig into than just the surface spectacle of Bocil Sultan Kaya Raya, because this is the kind of movie that gets under your skin the longer you sit with it, revealing new layers of meaning in little gestures, throwaway jokes, and the way scenes are stitched together, and saying yes to more of this script almost feels like saying yes to going back into Bocil's head, walking through those corridors of glass and marble again, except this time we're not just watching what happens, we're paying attention to why it hits so hard, and what it says about us, our world, and especially our relationship with children and power in the digital age. When I think about how the film structures his journey, one image keeps coming back: that cheap old phone, the one that survived the accident, the one that was in his pocket when fate or code or some mad billionaire's fail-safe turned him into a sultan overnight, because that phone becomes this kind of silent witness to everything, a relic from his old life that now holds the keys to a new one, and the director knows it. That's why we keep cutting back to close-ups of that device, its cracked screen reflecting his face as he scrolls through bank apps, legal documents, and gaming streams, like it's a small mirror that doesn't just show his face, it shows who he's becoming. And it's fascinating how the film turns something so mundane into a totem of destiny. You watch him, in the beginning, just use it like any kid would, playing free games, watching YouTubers, messaging friends. But then, after the accident, the interface shifts, new icons appear, new permissions get auto-accepted, and suddenly this tiny rectangle of plastic and glass becomes a portal to billions, and you can almost feel the weight of that whenever he holds it. His thumbs hovering over buttons that don't just buy skins or loot boxes anymore, they move real money, real assets, real lives, and that's such a brilliant metaphor for how our generation, especially the youngest, is being handed tools that are way more powerful than anyone is willing to admit. Think about how easy it is for a kid to upload a video that reaches millions, to spend money with a tap, to stumble into viral fame without understanding what it means. The film takes that real phenomenon and just amps it up to 11, and that's one of the reasons it feels both absurd and eerily plausible at the same time, because we're already halfway there, and beyond that tech symbolism, there's also this thread of identity and language in the film that really stands out, especially around the word Bocil itself, because it's such a casual, almost dismissive nickname, a word people use online to mock or affectionately tease kids, like, look at this Bocil trying to act tough, and the movie takes that meme throwaway term and turns it into a mantle. Almost a title. Bocil as a character doesn't even really get a serious name, he's just Bocil, and that choice is loaded. He's treated, for most of the story, as a symbol rather than a person, by us as viewers and by the characters around him, and that's exactly the point, because the whole plot turns on what happens when a person you underestimate, a child you flatten into a label, suddenly becomes the pivot around which your financial universe spins, and you can see how this plays out in the way adults talk over him in boardrooms, in the way TV hosts introduce him like a novelty act rather than a human being, in Idea, Bocil Sultan Kaya Raya, with that exaggerated enthusiasm that hides this uncomfortable fact that they're essentially commodifying his story. It's the same energy you see when talk shows bring in viral kids and treat them like cute content instead of real people. And the movie is very self-aware about that, almost parodying its own fictional media ecosystem to hold up a mirror to our real one. So when we in the audience laugh at how he gets paraded around, we're also kind of laughing at ourselves and how quickly we would probably consume him if he existed in real life, sharing his clips, making edits, debating whether he's cringe, or based, or sigma, or whatever label the internet would slap on him next. And this idea of labels, of being reduced to a role, extends into how the film portrays class dynamics. His family goes from being orang kessel, ordinary, struggling folks, to suddenly being pushed into this ill-fitting category of sultan, and the movie captures all the awkwardness and internal conflict that comes with that, because it's not a smooth transition where they just adapt and everything is glamorous. It's this messy process where his parents, for example, still feel out of place in fancy restaurants, still don't know which fork to use, still get subtle side eyes from waiters who guess they don't belong there, even though their card limit is now higher than most people in the room. There's that one scene where his mom insists on bringing leftover food back home from a 5-star buffet, stuffing it in Tupperware hastily pulled from her bag, and Bocil is mortified, embarrassed, but also torn, because he knows that's who she is, that's their upbringing, shaped by scarcity, and now the environment they're in tells them to waste, to consume, to forget. It's a tiny, almost comedic moment, but it encapsulates an entire clash of values, and the camera lingers just long enough on her expression when she realizes people are judging her. You see the shame creep in, and that's part of the emotional cost of this sudden leap into wealth that the film doesn't shy away from. On the flip side, we also see how some neighbors flip their attitudes overnight once they hear the word Sultan attached to his name. People who once ignored or casually looked down on them now turn extra friendly, suddenly remembering their long friendship, asking for favors, pitching business ideas, and the script milks this for both humor and discomfort. Because we've all seen how money rearranges social circles, how quickly respect appears or disappears depending on what's in your bank account, and watching a child observe that shift, trying to understand why people's smiles feel different now, that's quietly heartbreaking. He starts to internalize the idea that affection can be bought, that loyalty is negotiable, and you can see how tempting it would be, at his age, to lean into that, to just accept that transactional reality and play the game, because when you're 12 and people suddenly laugh at all your jokes and say yes to all your whims, who wouldn't be seduced? The movie leans into that temptation in a really smart way with the whole Bocil Sultan persona online. Once the story breaks publicly and he becomes a meme, the internet basically turns him into a character, remixing his every move into content, taking screenshots of him in that oversized suit at board meetings, overlaying absurd captions, reenacting his little boss moments in TikTok skits, and you get this weird, layered experience where he starts consuming his own image the way everyone else does, scrolling past fan edits and parodies of himself, sometimes laughing, sometimes looking hurt, sometimes pausing just a second too long on a particularly harsh comment calling him a knack manja, rich brat, even though the movie has shown us all the ways he's still just trying to survive. That oscillation between adoration and hate is so realistic in today's internet culture, and the film captures that dizzying emotional whiplash without needing to over-explain it. Just watching his reactions tells the story, the way his posture changes, the way he starts editing himself, thinking about how each move will play online, like when he stops himself from crying in public because he doesn't want to give the trolls more material, and that's devastating, because no child should be thinking like that. And speaking of kids and performance, one of the most painful subplots involves his school life deteriorating under the weight of his new identity. Earlier on, we see him in the classroom, late but still very much part of the gang, sharing snacks, copying homework, joking about strict teachers, but once the Bocil Sultan story blows up, school stops being a sanctuary and becomes another stage. Teachers treat him differently, sometimes fawning, sometimes harsher out of some twisted attempt at keeping him grounded, while classmates shift into three camps: the opportunists who want freebies and clout, the resentful ones who feel overshadowed, and a small handful who genuinely care but don't know how to reach him anymore. You see this in that one scene where a rumored study group invitation is actually just a sneaky attempt to visit his new fancy house, and when he realizes that, there's this quiet shot of him closing his bedroom door on the sound of everyone laughing by the pool downstairs, their voices muffled as he puts on his headset and escapes into a game, drifting further into the one world where he can still be just player one, and not some weird hybrid of child and chairman. That alienation is crucial to understanding his later choices, because a lot of what he does with the conglomerate is, at some level, a response to that loneliness, his trying to build a world that makes sense, a game where the rules at least feel somewhat fair, because the real-world rules suddenly feel broken and arbitrary, and when the movie starts pulling him into those bigger, more abstract moral questions, land rights, worker welfare, data privacy, it never forgets that his entry point into all of that is deeply emotional and personal, not ideological. He cares about that field because he played there. He worries about exploited kids in supply chains because his own image is being exploited for profit. He pushes for transparency because he's tired of adults making decisions about his life behind closed doors. That's how the film avoids feeling like a lecture on capitalism and instead feels like an organic growth of a child's widening awareness, world expanding bit by bit from his street to his city to the invisible infrastructure of capital that suddenly has his name stamped on it. And then there's Artie, whose character arc mirrors and refracts all of this in a fascinating way, because in many stories like this, the company man would just be a straightforward antagonist. But here he's this deeply conflicted guy who actually sees pieces of his younger self in Bocil and is both inspired and terrified by him. Early on, when he's sent to handle the boy, he approaches the task like any other assignment: mitigate risk, secure control, keep shareholders calm. But as he spends more time with Bocil, he starts to question whether the very thing he's supposed to contain might be the only honest force capable of changing the monster he's spent his life feeding. The writing gives him small, humanizing beats that gradually peel back his layers. Those quiet phone calls with an aging mother he supports but rarely visits. His old photos tucked in a warm wallet showing him as a kid playing in a slum not unlike Bocil's neighborhood, the way he unconsciously switches language registers when talking to executives versus when he's alone with Bocil, slipping into more casual, almost brotherly speech. All of this paints a picture of a man who climbed the ladder so hard he forgot why he started climbing in the first place, and when the founder's bizarre will system comes to light, that randomizer designed to blow up elite control if certain triggers were met. Artie's reaction is one of the most important in the film, because it's not just shock at the legal chaos, it's this deep, almost existential offense. He dedicated decades to mastering the rules of this game, and now he's being told that all that merit, all that strategy, can be bypassed by a glitch that crowns some kid king overnight. You can feel his resentment when he snaps. So everything I did means nothing, in that tense scene with the legal team. But later, sitting quietly in that pantry, trading stories over instant noodles, you see him beginning to entertain a different narrative. Maybe the game was rigged from the start, and maybe his complicity is what needs re-examining, not just the randomness of Bocil's ascent. That's why his subtle shift from corporate handler to reluctant ally feels so satisfying, not because he becomes a saint. He still protects his own interests, still backchannels, still hesitates when things get risky, but because he represents that crucial, uncomfortable truth, real systemic change almost always needs insiders who decide, at some point, to sabotage the machine from within, or at least bend it in new directions. And the film is brutally honest about how precarious that kind of internal revolt is. There's always the sense that Artie could betray Bocil under pressure, or that his support might buckle if his own position is seriously threatened, which adds this constant low-level tension to their interactions. Can I really trust you? Hum that never completely goes away. And then, on a broader cultural level, Bocil Sultan Kaya Raya taps into something a lot of people, especially in Southeast Asia, are feeling right now. This whiplash between old-world poverty and new-world digital prosperity, where in a single generation, you can go from villagers to vloggers, from street stalls to stock options, and yet the emotional, ethical, and cultural software in our heads is still catching up. The film uses its flashy premise, kid becomes secret owner of a conglomerate, as a magnifying glass on that transitional era, showing us the cracks, parents outsourcing their hopes to their children's potential virality, kids learning about money first through microtransactions instead of physical savings. Communities torn between celebrating any local success story and side-eyeing it as a sellout move, and that local global tension is embedded everywhere, from the way the conglomerate is constantly courting foreign investors while disrupting local ecosystems, to the way Bocil idolizes international gaming streamers but finds his moral compass anchored in hyperlocal memories, like that street food stall near his school or the laughter echoing from that patched-up football field. Visually, the movie hammers this home by constantly juxtaposing small, cramped, lived-in spaces with wide, sterile corporate ones, the older, cluttered house versus the sprawling minimalist mansion, the classroom filled with chipped desks versus the massive auditorium of the shareholders' meeting, and each time it does, we see how much smaller Bocil feels in the big spaces compared to the old ones, even if technically those new places are his now. That visual language subtly underlines one of the film's core theses: ownership on paper doesn't automatically translate to belonging, and you can be the legal overlord of a skyscraper and still feel like an imposter who'd rather be barefoot on hot concrete, dribbling a worn-out ball with your friends. And that brings us back to the final choice he makes at the shareholders' meeting, where, instead of performing the script written for him, that bland, investor-friendly reassurance designed to smooth ruffled feathers, he opts for a messy, honest confession that essentially puts a target on his back, because the second he admits publicly that his power is arbitrary, that the system is weird and broken, he gives ammunition to everyone who wants to challenge and delegitimize him. But at the same time, he also flips the narrative. Instead of pretending to be the prodigy CEO who earned his status through genius or hustle, he claims the one advantage his origin story gives him: perspective, and he uses it as leverage, saying, in essence, if the system chose me by accident, maybe that's exactly why I'm the right person to question it, because I have nothing to defend, no fake meritocracy myth to protect. That moment, delivered in the unpolished, slightly stumbling cadence of a real kid trying to articulate feelings that even adults struggle to name, lands harder than any slick monologue could, because it cuts through so many contemporary illusions about wealth and success. We live in a world that loves to retroactively justify insane inequality by telling stories about genius, hard work, and destiny, and Bocil, a literal child who knows he didn't work his way up those levels, becomes a living glitch in that narrative, a walking exception that reveals how much of our economic reality is just luck, inheritance, and structural rigging disguised as virtue. And the film dares to ask, what if instead of ignoring that glitch, we listen to it? Let it reprogram us a little? This is why that ending on the field, with kids playing and vendors still selling their snacks, feels so powerful despite its simplicity. It's not some grand utopian transformation. The conglomerate still exists, inequality still exists, Bocil still holds immense power and all the moral hazards that come with it, but it's a concrete, visible example of how a different set of priorities at the top can ripple down in small, tangible ways. The film doesn't pretend that saving one field redeems all corporate sins, but it also doesn't dismiss the significance of that win. For those kids, that patch of ground is the center of their universe, and for the vendors, it's their livelihood. To them, the difference between a mall and a community space is the difference between erasure and continued existence, and the fact that this time, the people in the penthouse listen to the voices at street level, because one of those voices happened to sit in both places, is a glimpse of what more compassionate decision-making could look like if we stopped insulating power from the realities it affects. In that way, Bocil as Dalang becomes not just a secret manipulator but a kind of bridge, a translator between worlds that normally never truly talk to each other. And isn't that, in a strange way, what so many kids already are in our world today? Interpreters of tech for their parents, navigators of new social norms, first-generation college students bridging village and metropolis, young workers sending money back to families who never left their hometowns. The film takes that familiar bridging role and amplifies it to near-mythic levels, but the emotional truth underneath remains relatable. Growing up, for so many kids, means learning to speak two languages, the one of your roots and the one of your opportunities, and trying not to lose yourself translating between them. In the end, when you pull back from the lights and the plot twists, Bocil Sultan Kaya Raya feels like a long, complicated meditation on that, disguised as a flashy, fun movie about a Bocil getting rich. And maybe that's why it lingers the way it does, because beneath the fantasy, it's asking very real questions. If a child can see that our systems are unfair, what's our excuse for pretending otherwise? If a glitch can redirect billions, why do we act like nothing can ever change? And if someone as small, scared, and inexperienced as Bocil can try, in his clumsy, imperfect way, to make a monstrously complex machine slightly kinder, then what does that say about our own daily choices in the much smaller systems we control, in our homes, our schools, our workplaces, our online communities? Maybe that's the haunting genius of this story. It leaves you with an image of a boy, no longer just Bocil, standing in a field he helped save, money in his accounts, responsibility on his shoulders, mud on his shoes again just like in that very first shot, and you realize that after everything, the wealth, the headlines, the boardrooms, what really matters, what really changed him, wasn't the accident that made him rich, but the moments when he decided what to do with that richness. Especially when it cost him something, and as you sit with that, as you replay scenes in your head, you might find that the most important question the film asks isn't, what if a kid got rich overnight, but what would you do if you couldn't hide from the impact of your own luck? And the thing that clung to me, like humidity that won't let your skin forget the day, was how Bocil Sultan Kaya Raya keeps its promises by refusing to make the easy ones, how it stares into the glittering middle distance of sudden wealth and then chooses intimacy over spectacle, the way a camera gently chooses a breath over a panoramic gasp, because beyond the thrills and the neatly coiled tension, there's this steady hand guiding the film toward a question most stories of fortune are too noisy to hear. What do you do when abundance arrives without a story, when the money doesn't explain itself, when the legends that usually come bundled with wealth, hard work, luck, lineage, forget to show up, and all that's left is the machine's quiet affection for your account, a love that doesn't expect you to be good, only active? And if that's the case, where do you put your goodness? Where do you store it so it doesn't evaporate in the heat of use? That's why I keep thinking about the tiny rituals the movie gives Raka, those movements that sit next to money like prayer beside a plate, the little circle he draws with his finger above the phone before touching it, the sigh he hides in the space between double taps, the way he pauses not because the world told him to but because he wants to try living in a moment long enough to identify it, and the film understands that these are not mere quirks, they are battlements, and if you've ever had to make a decision that you knew would ripple out beyond your sight line, you know exactly how the body invents ritual to trick time into stretching. I want to return to the accident, to the hinge on which this door swings, because part of the movie's elegance is how it refuses maximalist catastrophe in favor of a subtle permission slip from fate, a glitch that feels more like a mispronounced name than a car crash, and when it happens, there's no swelling orchestra, just a rain gutter chuckle and a streetlight that tries to stay on and fails, and if you blink you'll miss it, which is what makes it feel real, because in our world, the moments that change everything prefer to dress like nothing, and what a relief to watch a film that trusts smallness enough to let it do big work. In the wake of that, Raka's growth isn't played like the usual montage of shopping bags and soft focus excess, instead it's an accumulation of mercies, small braveries paid forward, and when the big stuff does appear, cars smooth as whispers, offices irresponsibly high, the film frames them with the same attention it gives to a spoon touching a cheek. And that restraint becomes a way to measure the boy's internal weather, because the more control he learns to wield, the more the movie looks for evidence of whether that control has turned into a climate, and that's the puzzle the story keeps inviting you to solve without showing you the answer sheet. The supporting cast, let's linger there a little more, because the way they move around Raka creates a social grammar the boy then annotates, and that grammar feels achingly true. Demas' loyalty isn't quiet, it's noisy and awkward and embarrassingly pure, and when he holds on too tightly to a promise Raka made in a hallway, you see the old childhood truth that keeps causing adult pain. Kids hear everything we say and write it down on paper that doesn't fade easily, and when Nadia steps into a room, the camera leans back a fraction, adjusts its posture like a junior employee, hoping not to attract unnecessary attention, which is a visual way of telling us that she's learned to be the kind of person rooms respect before people do, and maybe that's the loneliest skill. Maya the journalist. Yo, I know people like to bag on portrayals of journalists in movies, but here the script lets her breathe, lets her fail for the right reasons, lets her hold a story too long because she wants to get it right, and her scenes are thick with a specific kind of quiet. It's the quiet of text messages that don't send, of sources that pause before speaking and then choose not to, of editors who understand the value of a scoop but also recognize that sometimes the scoop is a trap for everyone involved. And Saria India plays that slowing down like a musician who knows when not to hit the note, which is rarer than we give credit for. On a craft level, I could do a 3-hour live stream just scrubbing through the transitions, because those crossfades and elastic cuts are masterclasses in psychological pacing, like the way a shot of chrome dissolves into a school corridor, shifting the line of sight from Raka's reflection on the SUV door to his reflection in a glass trophy case, telling you without a single word how one kind of visibility becomes another. And there's a particularly vicious cut involving a handshake that is implied rather than shown and the rustle of paper that sounds too crisp to be innocent. And I swear, I felt my stomach do that weird rollercoaster drop even though we never actually see the hands meet, which is what I mean when I say the movie believes in suggestion as a weapon. More on the score, because sound here isn't ornamental, it's structural. Adriputra threads these metallic micro-rhythms under percussive bamboo tones, and in scenes where data moves like water, the music refuses to splash, it hums, it vibrates right at the edge of your hearing, so that even silence carries a residue of noise. And then, in a moment, when Raka nearly speaks a truth and swallows it again, the soundtrack gifts us a literal inhale, a semi-seat breath, and the whole theater leaned forward as if our bodies were answering the film back. And because we're bongo gaming, I have to honor how the film teaches you to read it like a system, and not a bossy one, a generous one, the kind that invites sequence breaking if you're clever enough, because those little UI ghosts that appear and vanish, a confirmation icon, a translucent ledger climb, a soft warning that never blooms into red, less about exposition and more about rhythm. They are the game telling you where the edges are without slapping your hand, and Raka behaves like a player whose curiosity is tempered by consequence, so when he discovers a route that saves time, he doesn't immediately sprint through it, he sends a paper bird first, he asks the terrain to reveal its mood, and that kind of cautious mastery is rare in characters written young. Usually they're either wild or wise, but here he is both, which is to say he is real. There's an argument you can have with this movie about philanthropy, about how money that arrives too fast often chooses charity as a cover song, and the film walks right into that with a raised chin, showing us a neighborhood library that hums with new electricity and warms with old community, a clinic that smells like antiseptic and hope, and a scholarship program that begins with lists of names written on line paper and ends with spreadsheets that sort the names by something less kind than need. And it would have been so easy to paint all of that with either halo or pitchfork, but instead we get faces. We get the exhausted smile of a mother who doesn't care where the grant came from as long as the medicine checks out. We get a principal who guesses that a logo never serves the school as much as it serves the logo, and we get a child who reads a book he would have never met otherwise and then copies the first page by hand because it's his now, which is where meaning lives, in a kid's notebook, not a press release. I've also been thinking about how the film treats adult authority, not as a monolith but as a set of styles that sometimes contradict each other, and it's hilarious and tender and painful to watch adults instinctively reach for the lullabies of power, rules, schedules, permission slips, only to find that the boy's face makes those lullabies forget the tune, and teachers get caught in the crossfire, because they are trained to regulate curiosity, not to harness tectonic shifts. And there's a scene where Raka's homeroom teacher, who has been pretending not to notice what he notices, chooses to notice in a big way, and the classroom goes quiet in the kind of silence that glows. And the speech he gives isn't really a speech at all but a confession that sometimes being an adult is just being a child with heavier pockets. And I swear the kid next to me in the theater made this little tch sound that teenagers make when they don't want you to know they felt something, and that was the review right there. Perhaps my favorite aesthetic decision is the recurring duet between glare and shadow, how the city's glass makes its own weather, and the light catching on those faces feels like another character, judgmental before it is kind. And the final act, when the movie allows darkness to take a more generous role, the black in the frame isn't emptiness, it's privacy. It's where the boy's heart goes when too many eyes are turned on it, and in that visual shelter, he makes one of the most beautiful choices a character like this can make, not to confess, not to beg, but to design for departure, and the way the camera watches him pack absence into objects, paper birds, a battered notebook, an old SIM card taped under a desk, feels like a workshop in how to exit a life without cursing it, because people are asking, let's talk plausibility, because tech-savvy friends love to pause and point and say, actually, but here's the thing, the film is honest about its scale of miracle. It confines its magic to one kind of breach and then keeps the rest of its physics intact, and for those of us who've watched systems wobble for less romantic reasons than a boy with a steady hand, the idea that a misfiled credential and a chain of obedient automation could bend reality is not a stretch. It's Tuesday, so if you want the story to answer whether this could happen, it shrugs in a way that feels unkind only to those who need certainty more than they need truth. Audience reaction, the real weather system surrounding a film, has been a garden of reactions that tell their own story, teenagers remixing the phrase silence is profit into jokes that slice both ways, parents swapping DMs about whether to let their kids manage digital allowances or keep cash in envelopes, office workers watching the boardroom scenes with a particular, exhausted grin that says I've been in that chair and I know what that nod means, policy nerds writing think pieces about the way errors prefer the shape of humanity rather than the shape of code, and then the artists, the fan artists, oh my heart, the way they captured Raka's eyes as tiny oceans, the paper birds as origami stalks, the city skyline as a sleeping animal that only opens its eyes when it rains. Thematically, the movie shoulders complicated contradictions like they're best friends arguing at a wedding, and it finds new ways to phrase old truths, that children are often asked to carry the hopes adults break, that money is a language that remembers nouns and forgets verbs, that systems, when adopted by people who were not consulted during their creation, alchemize into something both more humane and more dangerous, and specifically this film says something exquisitely local and stubbornly global all at once. In places where improvisation is a national sport, the most ethical thing you can teach a child is how to hesitate, and the movie's most radical lesson isn't how to win but when to stop, which is why that weird little pause Raka practices with his fingertip matters more than the sums that screenshot stands like to freeze and dissect. And yes, there's room for criticism, and in love I offer it, because the film's ambition occasionally outpaces its appetite, especially in a few third-act boardroom volleys where the dialogue gets a shade too aphoristic, where the characters speak in tattoo lines instead of speech, and while those moments made my eyebrows climb, the performances brought them back down, grounding the fortune cookie wisdom in the messy glue of human breath. And there's a subplot with a labor committee that deserves a half-hour more airtime, but the scraps we get are chewy, dense with history and humor, especially a scene where a worker uses a proverb to slice a legal argument into silence. And I don't know, maybe I just want more of everything when I love something, which is both a flaw in me and a compliment to the film. The real secret of the movie, the thing you feel but maybe don't articulate in the first watch, is how deeply it's about narrative ownership, about who gets to tell the story of what happened. And the movie very gently reminds us that whoever prints the ledger gets to decide whether a gift was won. And that's why Maya's arc matters even when it feels like it's floating parallel to the main current, because journalism, at its best, is just a way to give people the dignity of context, and when she finally chooses how to shape the story, it's an act of care not only for the boy but for the city's ability to recognize itself when it looks in a mirror. In terms of imagery burned into my brain, I keep replaying that tender moment, with the generator humming like a giant cat while Raka waits in a stairwell for a signal that may or may not arrive, and the staircase becomes a kind of scale, measuring fear against resolve, and the camera frames each landing as if it's a level in a game, and the door he finally chooses isn't marked exit or enter, it's marked with a smudge of a hand that touched it with hunger, and that's enough. The whole scene a poem about what counts and what doesn't when counting fails you, all of this wrapped in the very Indonesian rhythm of care and chaos, a city symphony tuned to the key of improvisation, and while global audiences will find their own reflections in the glass, there are details that sing specially in Bahasa-inflected lives, the way a night market scene doesn't exoticize hunger, how jokes arrive in the exact shape of internet banter and auntie gossip, how Bocil Sultan is treated not as a slur or a crown but as a mirror that each character must pass, deciding how much of their face to reveal, and the movie doesn't footnote any of this. it just trusts the world to recognize itself, and it trusts outsiders to love it without needing to own it, which is the kind of hospitality art should teach us. So when people ask me what I felt at the end, I tell them I felt a combination of ache and permission. Ache for the boy who proved that precocity is just another word adults use when they are surprised to find intelligence in places they didn't audit, and permission to believe that detours can be ethical if you treat them as responsibilities rather than shortcuts. And maybe that sounds like I'm trying to wring meaning out of a movie that could have been content to be a thrill ride, but honestly, that's the generous mischief of Bocil Sultan Kaya Raya. It pretends to be about money and ends up being about timing, about how the most human thing on earth is to pause before you touch what might change you. And because I know you care about future lanes, here's what the film also does quietly. It sets up a world roomy enough to wander back into, if the storytellers decide to, with characters who could carry more of the weight without breaking. Demas has lines that want to grow roots, Maya has a compass that points to places not on the current map, Nadia has a vulnerability tucked into a sleeve we never see her roll up, and Raka, well, Raka has a blueprint in his eyes that could either be a city plan or a path back home, and the film ends not by sealing the door but by placing a latch within reach of little fingers, which is a beautiful way of saying, the story may be done with us, but we're not done with it. If you're still wondering whether it's worth your time, your ticket, your attention span in the era of 15-second epiphanies, I'm telling you yes, because while it gleams with high-gloss skill, it breathes with the humble pace of someone learning to be careful with their strength, and that is a rare and necessary thing right now. Across screens, across feeds, across streets where we walk past one another with pockets full of tools we do not fully understand, and if a boy in a movie can teach us to treat those tools with a little more patience, then maybe cinema is still doing the quiet, stubborn work it was born to do, holding a candle up to the complicated parts of us and letting us decide, together in the dark, whether to call the light a gift or a question. I want to leave you with the image that makes the whole thing click for me. Raka sitting at a table that's too big, his feet not touching the floor, his ankles rotating in tiny nervous circles, and he is surrounded by adults who have learned to inflate their sentences so they take up space, and he waits, and he listens, and he learns that the first power anyone ever has isn't the power to say yes, it's the power to wait long enough for someone else to show you what they really want, and when he finally speaks, he doesn't deliver an aphorism or a threat, he asks a question that is so simple it cracks the room open, and that's when I recognized the soul of the movie. Child who refuses to be the sum of the system's flattery, who chooses to treat wealth as a tool and not a self, and if I'm sentimental for believing that's possible, then thank this film for making me sentimental in a way that feels like exercise instead of indulgence, stronger the next day, steadier in the next conversation about what we owe each other when we have more than we need. I could keep talking, truly. I could map the boardroom glass like constellations and trace the way the sound of a push notification becomes a drumbeat in your memory. I could catalogue every paper bird and the precise moments when the movie lets the city be loud and then insists on quiet. I could quote you lines that are currently living on coffee shop napkins and group chat names, but I'll hold here, at the edge of a feeling that deserves your own words, because the best reviews are just invitations disguised as opinions. And all I want is to invite you into that stairwell where the generator hums and the boy breathes and the decision waits like a coin in dizzying sunlight, and I want you to choose what to do with the coin, whether to flip it, pocket it, throw it into a fountain and make a wish you're willing to work for, whatever your choice. Bring it back to me in the comments so we can compare notes like friends who just beat a level by two different routes, because that's the kind of conversation this film births, not who's right but who noticed what, who learned when to pause, who found a door where a wall used to be, and maybe in that sharing we become a little wealthier in the only currency that never devalues, attention paid kindly, attention paid forward, attention spent where it counts most, on the complicated, ordinary, extraordinary people we are becoming together. So we're still here with this kid, this Bocil Sultan, who accidentally took a seat at the top table of capitalism, and the more we keep peeling back layers of Bocil Sultan Kaya Raya, the more it starts to feel less like a one-off wild premise and more like a mirror maze, every angle showing us something different about money, childhood, and how power actually works when you strip away the Instagram filters and the motivational quotes. And staying with this script a bit longer lets us really sit with the quieter, heavier parts of the film that are easy to overlook when you first watch it, because on the surface there's so much noise, the cars, the mansions, the memes, but beneath that there's this persistent ache running through almost every scene, the ache of a kid growing up too fast, and of adults who never really grew up emotionally even as they amass status and control. One of the film's smartest decisions is how it refuses to draw a clean line between child and adult. In terms of maturity, ironically, it's usually the smallest person in the room who's asking the biggest questions, and the tallest ones who are dodging them. You see this dynamic really clearly in that scene where Bocil, still in his school uniform, sits in on a risk management meeting, sneakers not even touching the floor properly as he swings his legs under this massive oak table, and the adults are talking around him in those long, empty buzzwords: stakeholder value, short-term volatility, market confidence. And then he just quietly asks, if this project hurts so many people, but makes so much money, does that mean money is always more important? There's this dead silence, and then some executive laughs nervously and says, anak ya, so innocent, before pivoting back to the PowerPoint, but the question lingers, unaddressed, and we in the audience feel it snag somewhere deep. That moment crystallizes one of the movie's central critiques, that the grown-up world we're all told is so complicated often uses complexity as a shield to avoid confronting very simple moral truths. The film keeps poking at that laziness, the way responsibility gets deflected upwards, downwards, anywhere but here, and it does that by putting Bocil in rooms where those evasions are on full display. What's fascinating is how he processes all this, because at first he just accepts it's complicated as an answer, the way kids do when adults shut down a topic, but over time, as he learns more about how the systems actually function, which accounts move money where, who signs what, how news cycles can be nudged, he starts to see that complicated often just means inconvenient to our wallets. That's when you see the gamer in him kick in, the part that instinctively looks for mechanics under the story, patterns under the chaos. The film uses his time spent with strategy games and online communities as his secret schooling in systems thinking. Like, there's this brilliant sequence where we watch him grinding a difficult game level late at night, trying again and again to beat a boss that seems impossible, and then, intercut with that, we see him poring over corporate flowcharts and legal docs the same way, tracing lines, testing different scenarios in his head. Gaming taught him that every unbeatable boss, every broken map, still has some kind of logic you can exploit if you're stubborn and observant enough, and he applies that stubbornness to a real-world boss far more terrifying than any digital dragon, the conglomerate itself. That's why the founder's bizarre failsafe, that randomizer that hands ownership to a random civilian in the event of a catastrophic glitch, feels, in a twisted way, like the ultimate in-game mechanic, something designed by a frustrated dev who was sick of pro players monopolizing the ladder. But the movie doesn't romanticize that choice. Instead, it presents the founder almost like a ghostly presence haunting every major set piece. This unseen man whose attempt at posthumous justice is as flawed as the empire he built. When Bocil finally learns the story of this founder, through a combination of hacked files, old press interviews, and Ardy's half-remembered anecdotes, we see a classic arc, a genius coder from humble beginnings, rising up, building a conglomerate in the image of his own paranoia and ambition, only to realize late in life that he's become the very kind of untouchable super-elite he once despised. His solution, instead of dismantling his own empire while alive or changing its practices thoughtfully, is this dramatic gesture of rolling the dice with other people's lives, almost like he's playing God for one last gratifying move. The film doesn't give him the dignity of being a pure martyr or a cartoon villain. He's flawed, paternalistic, arrogant, and yet just desperate enough to try something drastic. What makes this reveal so emotionally effective is how Bocil reacts to it. At first, he's drawn to the idea that he's special, chosen, what kid wouldn't be? But once he understands that the selection was essentially random, that he could have easily stayed in that hospital bed as just another statistic, he's hit with this wave of survivor's guilt. The film shows it in small details, his sudden discomfort with the phrase, Rezeki anak shol, being thrown around by distant relatives as if his fortune is purely divine reward. His habit of counting how many zeros he moves with each tap and then mentally comparing that to how many zeros were on his family's debt statements before that cognitive dissonance becomes too heavy to ignore, fueling his need to do something, anything, that feels less arbitrary than the glitch that started it all. Another aspect that deepens on rewatch is the movie's treatment of media, not just social media, but traditional news, PR, infotainment, as a kind of second, overlapping game board where narratives are traded like stocks. We see early on how the conglomerate's PR team tries to spin his story, first burying it, then co-opting it, making slick, inspirational content about the boy who proves that opportunity can come to anyone, plastering his face on CSR campaigns and scholarship programs that don't actually change much under the hood. What's both darkly funny and sobering is how effective these shallow moves are at buying goodwill. People share the clips, praise the company for its heart, and the stock price ticks up a little. But the more Bocil becomes aware of how his own image is being weaponized, the more uncomfortable he gets. There's a particularly sharp scene where he's doing a photo shoot for some education equality campaign funded by the conglomerate, standing in front of kids from a poor school, handing out backpacks for the cameras, and after the photographer shouts, "Cut," the crew immediately starts collecting the props, taking back some of the items they only had enough budget to rent for the day. One little boy asks if he can keep the bag, and the coordinator snaps, "It's just for the picture," before laughing it off, and Bocil just freezes, caught between his corporate handler's glare and the kid's disappointed face. Later, he goes home and rage buys a shipment of real supplies to send anonymously, but the scene stays with him, and with us, as a clear indictment of how easily looking, the clip goes viral, spun as wholesome content, but for some viewers, including Ardy, it's a first glimpse into who he actually is when not performing. Later, there's a deliberate callback where he chooses to turn cameras on himself, insisting that a tense internal meeting be recorded and made public, forcing transparency in what would have otherwise been another closed-door decision about a controversial project. The symmetry between those two camera moments, the accidental reveal of his kindness and the intentional use of visibility as a weapon, tracks his growth perfectly. He moves from being acted upon by the lens to wielding it, from content to creator of narrative. Thematically, this ties into one of the film's most piercing questions: in a world where everything is a story, who gets to tell it, and for what purpose? And by giving that power, even partially, to a child who's still figuring out what's right, the movie dramatizes the stakes of narrative control in a way that's both entertaining and unsettling. We can't talk about narrative without touching on how the movie portrays success, more broadly, especially through the generational lens. Bocil's grandparents, if they appear in your interpretation of the story, offer a stark contrast. Living in a quiet rural area, unimpressed by skyscrapers, more concerned about whether he still remembers how to greet elders properly. When he visits them after the accident, they treat him almost exactly the same, scolding him for staying on his phone too long, cajoling him to join in simple chores or accompany them to the market. There's a warm, almost nostalgic sequence where he helps harvest vegetables or ride on the back of an old motorbike past rice fields, and you can see his shoulders relax in a way they haven't in the city. Here, nobody cares how much is in his account, he's just their grandson. That sequence isn't just there to romanticize simplicity, it's a reminder that there are entire value systems that don't revolve around capital accumulation, and that Bocil, for all his new responsibilities, still has access to those roots. Later, when he's struggling with his decision about restructuring the company, he thinks back to those days, to his grandfather telling him something like, "Kalau kau punya lebih, jangan lupa lihat sekelilingmu." If you have more, don't forget to look around. It's a cliché in isolation, but in context, spoken by someone who has never had more, who still wakes every day to tend a small plot of land, it carries a weight that corporate mission statements can't replicate. By threading these modest, grounded scenes between the high-octane corporate drama, the film keeps any grand gestures from floating away into abstraction. Every time we think of him as owner, it pulls us back to him as Choo-choo, as friend, as classmate. That tug-of-war is the emotional core of the movie. Now, stepping back to look at audience reception, you can almost predict how different groups would latch onto different aspects of Bocil Sultan Kaya Raya. Younger viewers might be drawn in first by the fantasy, the idea of waking up debt-free, being able to buy all the games and gadgets you want, flexing on bullies with real status. But many of them will also see themselves in his discomfort, his overexposure, his online anxiety. Older viewers, especially parents, might initially fear the premise, imagining their own kids under that level of scrutiny and pressure, and in that fear they'll likely see shades of their real-life dilemmas: how much to push their children to excel, how much to protect them from the harsher edges of the world. And then there's the working adults, the ones stuck in the very kinds of corporate structures the film critiques, who might read Ardy as their avatar. Tired, compromised, but simmering with a buried desire to see something, anything, change. The movie offers catharsis to each group but also implicates them, gently reminding parents of how they project onto their kids, workers of how they rationalize their complicity, and youth of how easy it is to chase clout at the expense of substance. And then, across all demographics, There's this shared unease that the film taps into about how financial systems are becoming more abstract, more automated, more out of reach of ordinary people's understanding, by turning those systems into something a kid can accidentally own. With a stray data handshake, the story doesn't just exaggerate for drama, it points to a real fear that the levers controlling our lives are hidden inside devices and codes that very few of us truly grasp. Bocil, in learning to navigate those levers, becomes a kind of stand-in for our own fumbling attempts to figure out online banking, investment platforms, identity leaks, data trade. We all, on some level, feel like children pressing buttons we don't fully comprehend, hoping the system is honest when we know deep down it isn't. The movie externalizes that sensation and then gives us one small figure who decides not to just adapt, but to question, and ultimately to reshape where he can. It's aspirational, sure, but it's anchored enough in emotional reality that we buy into it, at least within the film's logic. And when you step away, when the credits are long gone and you may be scrolling through your own feed again, there's this lingering, uncomfortable thought: if a fictional Bocil can look at a machine that big and ask, why does it have to be like this, what's stopping us from asking the same in our own much smaller contexts? Maybe that's what makes Bocil Sultan Kaya Raya so sticky as a piece of storytelling. It refuses to let us keep our fantasies clean. It hands us the dream, the overnight wealth, the end of bills, the shiny stuff, and then insists, over 2 hours of heart, humor, and tension, that we look directly at the bill that comes with it, the emotional tax, the ethical tax, the relational tax. It doesn't say, don't want this, but it absolutely says, know what it costs. And in that sense, it's not just a movie about a kid with money, it's a story about what happens when any of us, at any age, get what we thought we wanted and then have to decide who we're willing to be to keep it.